Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Done and Dusted. I'd like to welcome my fellow potty, Counsel of Counsel Family Lawyers.
Hi, Darren.
Hey, and our special guest today is Vincent Papaleo, who's going to tell us all about resist and refuse dynamics. Vincent, of course, is a well-known clinical psychologist in the family court and presents often on topics of this nature. Welcome, Vincent.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Carolyn.
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Nice to have you on board.
Okay. Where would you both like to start?
I'd like to start at the very beginning, as Maria said. I think this refuse-resist dynamic has become a popular terminology in the family court more recently, but it's been in existence for a long time, hasn't it, Vincent?
It has, Darren. In previous days, it was referred to as alienation, but I think alienation probably doesn't encapsulate the extent of the sort of problems that these young people are experiencing. I would say that alienation itself is an extremely rare phenomenon where you're talking about one parent who acts with malevolence to damage and disturb and disrupt a child's relationship with the other parent, whereas children who refuse and resist contact with their parents is actually quite a common phenomenon within the population we see, and especially so when there's a lot of conflict between parents. I think that the dichotomy of it's alienation or not alienation oversimplifies what is an immensely more complicated dynamic, that there are a multitude of reasons why children reject, refuse, and resist contact with a parent. Some of those are justified, for example, where there is abuse, neglect, severe mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse. And then there are other cases that are more down the continuum of being unjustified, where children are rejecting a parent because of often their embroilment in their parents' conflict. Often they are overwhelmed by their parents' conflicting stories, their parents' litigation, the stress and the anxiety. There are some children who resist contact with a parent because they're not that familiar with that parent. Other children have normal familial affinities and developmental affinities. I think to split what is enormously complex human relations into its alienation or not alienation is simplifying and dumbing down a concept to a level that makes it almost unhelpful and not useful.
Yeah, well, people get confused with alienation, don't they? Because people often think it's a syndrome, which it's not, as we know.
Clearly not. Yep.
No, but I ran a case recently which involved bits of this and bits of that, and we didn't run it as an alienation case. We ran it as a case involving alienation, involving enmeshment, involving alignment, because, as you said, often they're complexities that overshadow these particular dynamics, aren't they? And it's not necessarily one thing only, is it?
Look, it isn't, and very often these cases have a long history that predate their contact with us. Increasingly, what I'm seeing, Darren and Carolyn, is that you see these children who are confronted with these really intense, conflicting parental disputes and parental conflict, and they can really find themselves in a state of psychological dissonance in which they're simultaneously presented with conflicting views of reality. So you have mums and dads who are working their way through their own conflict, who share with their children their views, their beliefs, their experiences, their story about what's going on, and especially those parents who feel compelled to emotionally correct and justify their behavior and what's being told to the children, which inadvertently places these young people in the middle of conflict. So they're hearing different things and different stories all the time.
Which is very confusing.
They absorb so much information, don't they? And
absolutely,
parents may think they've got their filters on. I agree with you. I think it's actually a rare parent that actually sets out to destroy a child's relationship with the other parent. I think that's the easy get. I'm not seeing the child, therefore they must have done something. We know that kids have to live in a household, and we know that kids are privy to a lot of information, and there's a lot of information that's not even spoken information that a child can pick up on.
Look,
Does
Carolyn,
that make sense?
Carolyn, you couldn't be more on the money. I would say that one of the great advantages of saying that I have been alienated is that it means that the responsibility for the problems sits exclusively outside of myself.
Yeah.
So that by having the alienation, non-alienation dynamic means that one parent can abdicate contributing to the problems whatsoever because the other parent is the alienator. And there's not much in the way of self-reflection. And when you say that children are absorbing what's going on all the time, they're absorbing not only what is said, but also what is not said. They are absorbing the look, the grunt, the sigh, all of that conveys such a clear meaning. And many of these children are left in a real state of confusion and bewilderment as they're trying to understand the conflicting and competing stories, how to make sense. So increasingly what I am seeing in my work are children who, when asked and explored, and it's unpacked, is that they don't know what to believe. They don't know who to trust, that they don't want their parents talking about the other parent badly, that they do not want to hear their parent's story, that they do not want to carry messages between their parents. And yet for the majority of the young ones I'm seeing, if given an opportunity, will talk about what it is like to hear their parents' conflicting stories, talk about the impossible state of being trapped in the middle, of hearing their mum and dad speak badly about each other and trying to manage this. You know, whilst these are immensely complex phenomena, I would say that for the majority, I'm seeing sort of three basic groups. That group of kids who are hearing conflicting stories and just become extremely, extremely anxious, not knowing who and what to believe, and really feeling very burdened and preoccupied with their parental story and all the conflict that has besieged the family. Other children, when confronted with this dissonance, are literally splitting themselves and fragmenting themselves so that they say and do different things in the presence and the company of both parents. So their parents are hearing different stories and the child is often aligning themselves to that story. So we often hear the description of children behaving in the way their parents want or expect. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think that these kids become immersed within a narrative, their parents' narratives, and behave in a manner which is consistent with their parents' belief. Of course, that becomes an incredible source of parental conflict because the children actually say and do things that are quite different in each parent's home. And so the parents are presented with a story that is consistent with their own beliefs, and of course then becomes a source of tension and conflict between them insofar as what the child has and has not said.
Oh, sorry.
We've seen that a lot, haven't we, Darren, in independent children's lawyer work?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where I almost call it childhood schizophrenia. I know that's the wrong term, and I know schizophrenia has lost its credence, but Darren, that shuttle between mum's house and dad's house, where certain behaviour is acceptable at mum's but not acceptable at dad's, and the kids intrinsically know that.
Yes.
And you would have seen that occurring a lot in your independent children's lawyer work, I dare say.
Yeah,
Indeed.
I think it's I'm beginning to think it's worse than that, because you've got the child, as you guys just said, being caught in the middle of this conflict. But I think the whole system works against the child in the sense that it's almost like the child's being drawn and quartered, which sounds a bit gross and graphic, but see, you were talking about parents trying to justify their own position. The problem is that at the very onset, when people lawyer up, or just before, even if they go to counselling, they aren't properly reality tested. And what the court proceedings do is simply, they simply justify, some lawyers justify their own parents, their own clients' actions, which are then fueled by affidavits, which are really the words of the solicitors, making the parents' story sound a bit more fancy maybe, until they eventually get in the witness box 2 years later. But it's all about fueling this justification where, you know, if you tell a lie to yourself more than enough, eventually you'll start to begin to believe your own lies. Well, it's a bit like that, where parents aren't properly reality tested. And as a result of that, the spillage comes onto the child from both sides. And it's just a mess, don't you think? I just think there's just such a lack of reality testing at the front end of these things. because lawyers are trying to advance their own client's case, and I just don't think it assists. I know you don't do that, Caroline. I know you're a tough reality tester, but cases I see, parents, and sometimes I get to see them too late, they're not properly reality tested.
It's also the car crash, isn't it, Vince and Darren? Where you have two people standing same line of sight, same visual acuity, and you ask them about that car
What
crash,
they've seen.
and you will get two completely different versions because of what we bring to any given situation is our past experiences. The total sum of our past experiences, coloured and informed by that life journey. And you add to that the volatility of a relationship in free fall or a separation with the bitterness associated with that. So that's where I think the complexity for us comes from. And I think putting neat little labels, this is why I'm finding this conversation so fascinating, Vince, because it literally blows out of the water many people in the profession, and this is the legal side of things, playing catch up with where you go as social scientists and your understanding of the lasagna of what is actually occurring in the lives of these children.
I think to describe a child who's refusing or resisting contact with a parent from a single perspective, that is alienation, runs the risk of dumbing down what is a much, much more complex and sophisticated process.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I have seen cases where it is clearly really alienation in the sense that it was once described, but it is so rare. And usually you're dealing with a parent who's so personality disordered or so psychiatrically unwell that it's I could probably count the number of cases I've seen where I've thought it's genuine parental alienation on one hand over all the years I've done this.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't, however, having said that, the number of children I see who are caught amidst who are the passengers in that car crash, who are hearing different explanations and different sides to that story, for them to split one reality off and reject that parent so that they can live in a single coherent world, to me feels quite different. And it feels to me as though it's an attempt to find a solution to get through the midst of all of this.
I wonder
you never get this sort of behavior in the cases of where parents are not in such incredible conflict. It's the conflict and the escalating emotions that infuse into the child and create for them this intolerable middle ground where they're constantly sifting through what and what not to believe.
Yeah, I wonder, it'd be interesting if anyone's done any research. I don't know of any, but you might, Vince. In this day and age where children, I wonder, do they split off more than what they did in the past in the sense of, look, this conflict's too hard. I'm sitting in mum's camp or I'm sitting in dad's camp because I don't
Look, I think,
anymore.
Darren, I think it's interesting that with the introduction of the voice of the child and emphasis on that, children have more of a say. And so potentially they are drawn into the conflict in a different way than they have been previously. Now, I do think it is extremely important to have the child's voice heard and for that to be an important part of the whole conversation. But that also entails asking the right sorts of questions and not being seduced into your own beliefs and your own confirmation biases. So if you believe it's alienation, then it's likely you'll only ask the sorts of questions that will lead you to a conclusion of alienation without broadening your thinking and thinking much more comprehensively about this child in this family, in this context, and what their behavior is trying to tell us. It's also my observation that for many involved in this sort of dispute, that the child's behavior becomes a source of erroneous understanding, that we tend to see in the child's behavior that which we believe to be the case. So if the belief is that the other parent is capable of any atrocity, then the child's refusal, reluctance, or hesitance in having a relationship with that child might be seen through the lens and the belief that it is the other parent who is causing that, without considering the possibility, for example, that the child is also sensitive to how that parent is feeling and spoken and unspoken messages of restraint.
That is so true, because I think the legal system, leaving social science to one side, I think the legal system unintentionally dumbs it down because we want an answer as to the cause or the etiology of the issue at hand. So it becomes quite attractive to try and dumb it down. Because we're very solution focused. But we've spoken about it before, Vince, too, and it's something that really interests me of late, and that is trauma, and whether we're getting the true story from the child and or the parents as a result of the trauma they're suffering as well. I mean, that's often not taken into account at all. And we know what the impact of trauma is. And it would vary from case to case, I accept that. But some cases that we deal with, the children are very traumatized.
I think it's interesting, Darren, because many of the families we see are traumatized by the time they get to us.
Exactly.
And then it becomes pathognomonic. Then us seeing them becomes really even more traumatic. Some of the children I see are almost paralyzed in their ability to communicate and convey their feelings. So the what to do's about that can be really challenging. I think it's always really helpful in these most challenging of cases to try and gather information from as broad a perspective as possible, to try and understand what that child is communicating to us through their behavior. This is hard. And it's not in some ways surprising that trying to distill it down to black and white, true and false, good and bad is the nature of the process. I would say, however, that for children who are splitting their world into good and bad, black and white, all or none, are really in a state of psychological crisis. It's not a sign of psychological health to be black and white in your thinking. It is not a sign of psychological health to reject one parent completely. It is not a sign of psychological health to lack ambivalence. It's not a sign of psychological health to lack empathy and compassion. Many of the kids we are seeing, and especially when their parents have been involved in this process for a long time, really are not functioning well. And often their parents are not functioning well either. So trying to do less harm, not more harm, is really helpful. Trying to intervene with a sledgehammer when what's needed is a subtle, is a scalpel, is not helpful. To just wrench kids away from parents can be really traumatic and difficult. These cases bring with them at times insurmountable challenges. But to dumb this down to alienation, not alienation, therefore remove the child, is, I think, potentially a very, very dangerous intervention where the fallout of which can be really enduring.
That was the genesis, or probably not the genesis, but one of the major studies was Gardner's theory of alienation, wasn't it? Yeah,
look, keeping in mind that's now 40 years old, and we've moved quite a long way. And whilst what Gardner had to say was enormously controversial, was it the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? What's the answer to life, death, the universe? Number 49 or whatever it was. The parental alienation syndrome was sort of that back in 1980, 1990. It sort of answered everything, and so it was embraced with enormous gusto. I think our understanding of the whole refuse-resist phenomena is infinitely more complex.
And unique family.
The real question becomes, though, I guess, Vincent and Darren, about how do we then therefore resolve these issues without causing additional trauma? We know that court is a place of last resort. It always makes me despair when people reach for court, because again, it's that desire for clarity. It's that desire to, I want to be proven right. I want to prove them wrong. As Darren said, and as you've said, Vincent, black and white responses, lack of ambivalence. I want an outcome. Given that court is so traumatic, what other avenues can professionals, either from the psychological perspective or the legal perspective, offer to clients and families when we've got refuse and resist?
Early intervention is mandatory. As soon as weapons are drawn and shots have been fired, it can be remarkable how quickly these cases go from being problematic to entrenched. and unable to be shifted. And the painful reality is, for many, these families reach a tipping point from which it can be almost impossible to recover.
Yeah.
And I can assure you that in all of my conversations with colleagues all over the world, we all struggle with exactly the same issues. Some cases just become impossible to intervene in a constructive manner. It does seem that the commonalities of successful intervention are early intervention by the court, firm, clear, direct instruction from the court around cooperation and compliance and participation in psychological treatment. The participation of both parents is almost universally found to be associated with better outcomes. Having only one parent involved is not associated with a good outcome. You need to have clear structure and expectations for compliance, and the court may have to act in a robust manner, but this needs to be happening early. And there needs to be a clear pathway towards intervention with really strong direction from the court. And with the greatest respect to my legal colleagues, to turn the volume down on the noise. All the allegations and the counter allegations and the historical matters and who did what to whom and when it was done. It shouldn't be a free form, expression of every shortcoming fault. I'm not sure how you are, but if my spouse was to talk about all my shortcomings over the 35 years we've known each other, it would be a pretty long list.
Yeah.
And the question is, how relevant is that today to this problem? And what can we do? What can we do? These, especially the children we're seeing, their anxiety is overflowing. They're so worried, so anxious, so fearful, so frightened. No one is compressing the world down and holding on and giving structure and containment. Can I just point out that in no area of psychological theory or treatment in particular is avoidance the recommended intervention when children are feeling anxious. Never, without exception. Even in the cases of real trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder where children have experienced genuinely frightening, terrifying events, the goal of treatment is to help them manage and find solutions and contain their behavior and build structures and supports, not avoid and hide. And the problem with avoidance is that it works. One way to avoid the fear of dogs is to avoid dogs, and sometimes it's sensible to avoid dogs, but in a different sense, it's more constructive to help achieve an adaptive way of managing that.
Yeah.
And you can't, as you've said, by implication, you can't avoid a parent. A parent is a parent for life. Half of who you are is attributable to that parent. So avoiding a parent, as you say, simply delays the problem.
It's really interesting, Carolyn, that I've been reading recently a little bit about some of the comparative understanding of children who are involved in the family law jurisdiction and the child protection jurisdiction. And predominantly in the child protection jurisdiction, where you have children who are being really horribly and tangibly abused and hurt and physically hurt, that these children as a group are still trying to repair and connect to their relationship with their parent. They're trying, they show an incredible capacity for forgiveness, even an idealized fantasy of repair, that the parent will come back and apologize. In the family court, what we tend to see is a splitting off, and one parent becomes all bad and then deserving of rejection. And I suspect that is much more a function of the parental relationship. Even in the child protection jurisdiction, if there are two parents, they're likely joining together to fight the institution rather than splitting apart and fighting each other and their children falling in the middle of that. So unless we're able to help parents elevate and see the damage being done and that it can be helped, we won't be successful. And it's remarkable how, for many, they are impervious to the warnings and the risks and the damage being done to their children. When you have children who are splitting and rejecting a parent in the way that many of the kids we're seeing are doing, they are in psychological crisis, and the likelihood for them is that the outcomes will be poor in the extreme.
And generationally speaking, they carry that forward into their parenting.
No question about that. Obviously, research in this area is complicated, but there is one small study that actually suggested that children who have rejected a parent are at greater risk of being alienated themselves.
Mm.
Now, I'm not sure I understand all the complexities of how that happens, but still, and it's a small sample and I wouldn't want to draw conclusions, but as soon as you have such compromised relations with people who are so fundamental to your existence, I think you put yourself at risk. And at the risk of dumbing it down for myself, I often ask parents, are you hoping that your child will have a similar relationship with their future partner as you are having now? And the answer, of course, is no, but why model that? What do you want them to learn from you? Do you want them to learn, and what do you want them to learn about conflict? What do you want them to learn about respecting each other? What do you want them to learn about being resilient? What do you want them to learn about how to behave towards men and women and relationships? Do you want them to model your behavior? And they say no, and yet the next step of intervention is difficult. And if I can add, don't mean to be, again, critical of everyone, because I think for the majority, family lawyers are trying to do good, but intervening with these families and then having a legal letter usually blows them apart. That the conflict can be irreparable if we can't intervene.
In other words, that what the family really needs is a whole lot of positive micro steps back to build that bridge of parenting so the kids don't fall down through the gap.
There you go.
And yet the very process that we engage in, I was going to say allow them to indulge in, but engage in,
destroys the bridge.
You're backing up. You see it in animals before they strike. They often sort of back up, if you will. So you're compelling them to back up rather than build that bridge of commonality and parenting.
Yes.
And that really worries me.
Yes. Once we have once people become so positional, it can be very difficult to recover.
I was doing a case last week, and I said to the husband in the witness box, it's 2 years, and the paternal family hasn't had anything to do with my client. And I said, do you think by some magic, once these proceedings are over and the judge hands down a decision, that you're going to be all back on friendly terms again? Because I'm suggesting to you that you think you're apart now. After I've cross-examined you, you're going to be even further polarized. In fact, you're going to hate the wife even more and probably hate me as well. It's a pointless process, isn't it? There's no hope of olive branches or bridges or anything. It's a hopeless process. And on that note, we're going to do around the screen. I'm going to turn to my pod buddy first and just see what we got out of this session tonight, because I think it's been incredible. What do you say, Caroline? What's your takeaway from this tonight?
Well, the fact that these matters are incredibly complex and that it's a fool that wades in brandishing simplistic outcomes for families. And maybe there's many fools in the ranks of the legal profession who don't fully comprehend this, don't understand it. And we need to take our time. We need to get it right. And we need to think about the health of the children whose lives we touch to make sure that we create a more positive outcome for these families.
Yeah. What's your take, Vince?
Look, I think, Darren, my big take really is that the way in which these difficult cases are geared almost guarantees a poor outcome. We need to do it differently. We need to be, the thing for me is that lawyers are such extraordinary problem solvers. And if instead of taking a position of an adversarial position, it became a more cooperative one, where they directed their problem-solving skills to finding a solution in these difficult matters and be able to work in conjunction with us. And if we didn't have all the restrictions imposed around the rules of who we can and cannot talk to and how information can and cannot be shared, it might shift the whole perspective in a different way. My experience is that if you have the judge being prepared to make robust, strong decisions in the context of lawyers who are getting instruction but giving really solid advice from a cooperative and constructive basis, and we as mental health practitioners as seen not as potential adversaries, but rather trying to make a positive contribution and explanation for what's occurring in the family, you can get change.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I
If you
agree.
don't have all of those things pushing the same direction, we won't achieve any kind of success. And in particular, if there is not a court order requiring participation, I think the likelihood of the kind of outcomes that we hope for, and Carolyn's alluded to, will not occur. And if you don't have both parents involved, constructively working towards a better outcome, the chances of achieving an outcome that is beneficial to the children is almost non-existent. In the real world of psychology, and when you're treating children, you always involve parents, and you involve them together. I can have people who won't even sit in the same room, let alone work cooperatively. So it's a hard road forward.
Yeah.
Darren,
Well,
what's your
take,
takeaway?
yeah, my takeaway is early intervention, and I think there's a real difficulty, and sometimes there's no choice because the law is the law, and the structures are there, and the rules are meant to be complied with. But where social science meets those structures, there has to be a departure, and the departure has to be in the direction of social science to address these needs of children, because often people walk away from litigation very bruised, financially bereft of funds, and the children are even further traumatized and damaged. And I just don't think it's a good outcome for those kids, especially, and their parents moving forward. So, look, it's it's all a bit depressing talking about this, I must say. But if we didn't talk about it, people wouldn't get to listen to it and think about it, because I think it's really important these sorts of topics are aired, because I think we can do things a lot better. We're moving in a direction where we're trying to do that, but it's very, as you said, Vince and Caroline, it's very, very complex. Anyhow, it's been very informative tonight. Thank you so much, Vincent, for coming on our show, Done and Dusted. I thank you, my potty, as usual, Caroline Counsel, and her big smile.
Darren.
And her often...
Thanks for chairing, Darren, too.
Not at all. And thank you for this episode of Done and Dusted. Caroline will tell you where you can contact us or link on to us.
Well, you can certainly, in relation to the podcast, make sure you like it. It's certainly being posted in Facebook, LinkedIn, and on other major social media platforms. So if you liked what you heard, click like and certainly follow us. Thanks, Darren.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vince.